Yeah, well, I mean, we can only go up, right? So let's do that. We are in Mark chapter 16 today, and this is the culmination of the book. And the way this is written, it would the end would kind of sneak up on you. We're surprisingly close, closer than you might think, to the end of the book. So let's jump in here with verse 1 of chapter 16, and we'll go here for a few verses. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go and anoint him. And early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance for us?" When they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, this is the place where they laid him." So again, we get a little more of the details in other versions of the story. Other gospels have a little more background in terms of the stone, the angel. Typical of Mark, there's a little bit of confusion in this. You know, you might remember that in the Garden of Gethsemane, we saw a young man run off when they grabbed his robe. Here we're told about another young man dressed in a white robe. This is almost certainly supposed to be understood as some sort of angelic presence, a herald, a messenger. And he tells these women who have come to do the anointing of the body that he's not here. He has been raised. And the only real proof that is given is, look, he's not here. And what's interesting about this, I think, is twofold. Is one, the brevity of it. I mean, there's no, typical of Mark, there's no explanation. Mark has this way of sometimes giving us details we didn't ask for, and the details we'd really like, he doesn't seem as interested in. So we have this very kind of sparse story where he's just dropping in these incredibly miraculous things. And then the second one is and it's the very first instance of it, but this "do not be alarmed," almost laughable in the context. And we'll see here as we move through this text, fear is an outstanding part of this story. Fear is just woven through it. But here we get it introduced. Don't be alarmed, which is, it just is almost comedy. I don't know if Mark intends it that way, but there's a sense in which that's hilarious.
And not to be overly repetitive for those of you who have been with us, but as a reminder for everybody, and maybe to make sure everybody's on the same page, if you haven't been with us for a while. Once again, this section does heavily emphasize women as witnesses, which is a significant thing. Culturally, we wouldn't have expected this in the first century by any means. And then, once again, I just want to throw another nod at the reality. Notice in what's otherwise a pretty brief account, it's striking to me how much emphasis here is upon how big this stone is. The women are worried about how they're going to roll it away because it's so big. The text itself says the stone, which was very large. Once again, so I think the gospel writer here is, in another case, showing us how unlikely it would be that this story could be doctored, that what we're about to hear could have been a fabrication of the earliest disciples, which seems to be one of the sort of stories leveled against the early Christians. And, I think in the 21st century, we're very accustomed to people being cynics and skeptics, people who want to sort of push back against the faith. And it shouldn't be a surprise to us that the earliest of Christians were already aware of and dealing with some of these accusations of dishonesty or sleight of hand. And I think it's worth noting that the Gospels themselves address those kinds of issues.
Yeah, and then we move in kind of classic pattern. We move from this initial encounter to the idea that the message is sent out further. So verse 7, the young man, the angel, says to the women, "But go tell his disciples and Peter," and very interesting that Peter is listed separate here, "but go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." And so there is that sending element, that these women are entrusted with the message, that they are to carry it, they are to take it with them, they're to return to the disciples and witness that they have gotten this news, and that Jesus will be appearing to them and coming to find them. And then this is where, if Mark is known for a couple things, this is certainly one of them. Verse 8, "So they went out and they fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." And if you have a study Bible, there should be a note there that in all of the earliest copies of Mark that have been found, this is where the gospel ends. This seems to have been the original ending. And lots, as you can imagine, that has generated a ton of conversation about why would that be. But it leaves this huge question mark hanging over the story. We saw the centurion proclaim, "This man is the Son of God." Now these women have gotten the message that Jesus has been raised, and they're sent out with it, but they go and say nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And the people reading this, as is true with us as well, we know that that's not the end of the story. We know that word got out. So it sets up this very kind of internalized question: what do we do with the news? We as readers, we as people who have looked over the shoulder of the women into the tomb, as we have heard the proclamation of the angel, "He is risen." What do we do with it? Those of us who are sent, do we take the message out? Are we faithful with that? Do we evangelize? Or are we afraid? And again, that may have been an especially pointed question toward the recipients of Mark's gospel, who are possibly being persecuted and tempted with the threat of being silent in order to stay safe. And so I don't want to beat this into the ground, but just a fascinating way to leave the gospel hanging.
Which scholars have talked about how that might be reflective of the community that received this gospel. The idea that fear may have been a theme, especially a persecuted church would understand what it means to have fear because of the faith, because of that reality. But I think there's even more in this than that. I think it's fascinating that there is no follower of Jesus in the entire Gospel of Mark that we see portrayed as completely understanding who he is and courageously proclaiming the good news of who he is. And there's something deeply meaningful about that as it relates to being people who seek to be formed by the faith in our own lives. I think, sometimes we fall prey to this idea that faith could ever be perfected, that we could be some kind of green beret Christian who in every season of life could have the faith that we need for that day, and that we could sort of walk without guilt or walk without regret. And the Gospel of Mark, I think for me, just in the way that it lays out the entire gospel, makes it clear that God accommodates the reality that we're fallen humans. God accommodates our unbelief. God accommodates the fact that we come and see the greatest miracle he's ever done, and we're struck in bewilderment and fear. And that is what it is to be human. And God doesn't shame us for that. God saves us in that. And there's something deeply theological in the way that this ends right here. And I think, not to say that what comes later isn't helpful. I think we can talk about how the later material in many ways makes sense of how the church is trying to process what this book means. But if you're willing to just pause here for a moment and you're willing to practice a little bit of humble self-reflection, Clint, I really think that this is an invitation for us to see ourselves in a true light. And I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, I think it is incredible that in English, this is basically true in the Greek as well. They tend to put prepositions after the words they modify. We put them before. But it is fascinating that the Gospel of Mark ends with the word fear or afraid, that this is what closes this sort of question mark of what happens next. They were afraid. They were amazed, but they were terrified. And this phrase, they said nothing to no one. That's the exact same word in Greek. So they said nothing, or they said, not a word to not a person, kind of. It's intensified there by being doubled. And the question that leaves us as we read it is, well, did they ever get over their fear? And then we realize that the gospel is asking that question not of the characters, but of the readers ourselves. Did we overcome our fear? Did amazement push aside being afraid? And it's a fascinating part of the scripture. It's an amazing ending. It probably has gotten more appreciation as we've lived with it than it did initially. We'll cover so there are two alternative endings, what get called the shorter and the longer, but we'll look at the shorter today, just as a sense of, I think there's some stuff in it that's interesting. But the early church, it seems, has a kind of difficult moment in living with this open-ended ending. And so there has been one manuscript found. They call these old copies of documents manuscript. One manuscript has been found that has this shorter ending. And as I read it, I would invite you to just listen to it, because I think, having now gone through Mark, it's going to stand out as something that sounds different. So let me read this first. And all that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterwards, Jesus himself sent out through them, from east to west, the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. So now that last sentence is just about a dead giveaway. Even if you weren't told that this was something else, when you're reading the Gospel of Mark and you all of a sudden start getting the imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation, you start thinking, wait, what happened here? Did a college professor take over? What's going on? I don't think you have to be a Mark scholar, having read most of this, to think that sounds a little out of place, Michael.
Yeah, it certainly does. And notice how Peter makes an appearance in this short version. That's significant, as Peter becomes one of the leading, if not the leading voice of the early church and a significant authority figure. The idea that they did indeed speak. It reminds me of music, Clint, and you and I both know that I bring no particular expertise to music, but I know that chords need to be resolved at the end of songs, right? There's this sense that there's chord progressions, and you can get into the chord progression, and then there's this moment where a musician plays this chord, and your ear wants the next chord to happen to finish the song. And there are some times where I've heard songs where they don't resolve the chord, and you kind of sit at the edge of your chair, and you feel not right. Like the world does not feel like it has resolved like it should resolve. And you're sort of waiting. Okay, are you going to finish the song now? And then, they either do or they don't. And I feel like this is a chord resolution to what the actual ending here left. There was this sense of they were afraid. And so the people after were, well, that can't be the last note. And so they quick put in, that Peter is there, that Jesus sent them out to the east and to the west, that they're proclaiming the proclamation of the imperishable eternal salvation, right? There's this sense in which that sort of puts a period at the end of the story that we're comfortable with. But while that may be a note that we would like it to end on, I think that actually takes a little bit of the emphasis off of what we saw throughout the book of Mark. Let me explain what I mean by that. If you look at the Gospel of Mark, this gospel, one of its unique features is Jesus encouraging people to not share the good news, right? And to end the gospel with what's really two sentences where suddenly the disciples get it in the last two sentences of the book, I don't think does justice to the monumental task that we've seen the disciples go through trying to discover and understand who Jesus Christ is. And so I guess it's just one thing to say here, Clint, that I don't think that this is bad. I don't want to come down on it in a negative way. I think it makes sense that the church at one point in its history felt like this chord needs resolved. But I think if you're willing to live with a hard note, the idea that these women said nothing because they were afraid, then I think it makes sense of this entire book that's really been asking us, are we afraid? Do we understand who Jesus is? And are we willing, even if we are afraid, to share the good news? Because, by the way, they were afraid, and yet obviously they shared it. Masterfully done.
I think that's exactly the point, Michael. That we read this and we say, well, what did they do with the knowledge that Jesus was raised? And then the gospel sort of winks at us and says, gotcha, right? Because the early church knew that the story continued. They were literally living the proof that the word got out, that the story got out. So to think that Mark is primarily concerned with the historical nature of the story, that is, lining up all the facts, that's never been Mark's point. Mark's point has been telling us that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And he now shares this cliffhanger ending in saying, and people found that out, but what did they do with it? What happened? And my wife is a puzzle person, and particularly during COVID, we've had the puzzles out. And so if I'm feeling ornery, if I can get away with it, I'll just take one of the pieces randomly and put it somewhere. So that, there's this moment where you realize there's three spots left and you only have two pieces. And that's kind of the sense here. You can just feel the early church wanting to fill that gap. But the gap is the point that drives the question home. And I think I don't want to bore everybody, but this is amazing storytelling, amazing narrative, because all of a sudden you're in the middle of it in a way that I don't think you saw coming. If you give it an honest reading, it is now asking you questions when you thought you were asking it questions. And it's an incredible piece of writing.
My final word on this, Clint, is we sometimes make the mistake. It's not a significant mistake, but sometimes it's not helpful when we read one gospel in light of the information we have from the others. And the point I want to make with that is, I'd like to point out that in the Gospel of Mark, they do not ever see Jesus.
Yeah, 100%.
The resurrected Jesus does not appear in this book. Now, we know from Luke, from Matthew, that happens, but that's significant, right? The idea that Jesus has been resurrected, and the proof of it is the empty room. Not him standing there, but the emptiness is the proof. And to the church who is persecuted in Rome, if that's the church that receives this book, that is their evidence as well. The emptiness, the reality that Jesus is not in the tomb, that is what they have to put their faith in. And sometimes I think that extra knowledge that we have doesn't help us see, oh my goodness, the resurrection proof is the empty tomb, not Jesus standing there.
Right, because the natural assumption is, well, if they knew the details, maybe they would be more encouraged. But the truth is that maybe knowing that the gospel has always carried with it an uncertainty and a decision, and that the initial receivers of it were in the exact same position that we all find ourselves in, particularly in the persecuted church. In a strange way, that becomes even more encouraging. The messiness of the story then reflects their own in a way that I think is helpful. We will continue through the Gospel of Mark. We'll look at this so-called longer ending next week. We also need to transition, so we'll have some questions for you. I don't want us to go real long today, but we've been thinking about a couple of things. One is whether it would be helpful to go from Mark to another gospel, particularly John, because John is the most different. And we would have some carryover of information, but Mark is different enough that it wouldn't feel like doing the same thing over again. The other idea we had is to go into the deep end of the pool. Actually, John would be in the deep end of the pool as well, but maybe even a little further out and tackle the book of Romans, which is considered by many Paul's greatest work. It's got a lot of theology. It is the backbone for lots of Presbyterian theology and others as well. But it would be full-on Bible study and would be of a different nature than what we've been doing. So if you have a thought about that, you can let us know either today or drop that in the comments Monday. Let us know somehow. But we're trying to put together plans for where to go from here. Michael, did I cover everything? Was there anything I missed?
No, that's great. I think my comment is just, before you head out today, if you have a preference, put Romans or John in the comments. That would be helpful.
All right. Hey, thanks for your time, everybody. We look forward to seeing you Monday. Hope you have a good weekend. And thanks for being with us.
Hope the Lovealls get pizza.